All right, concept two. We're going to take a look at Franklin Delano Roosevelt's pragmatism and how he shifted from isolationism to eventually intervention. So when Japanese forces invaded China in 1937, this is when Roosevelt begins to turn from isolation to intervention. During Japan's takeover of Manchuria in 1931, the United States had done little more than express just outrage. But this time, Japanese did something different. They bombed Shanghai and sacked Nanking, right? So this was clearly a manifestation that they were going to take over all of China, which was worrying U.S. policymakers a great deal. So in a memorable address, Roosevelt urged the world to quarantine aggressors. It was a clear call for collective security. The speech aroused the isolationist senators who raised a new hue and cry against foreign entanglements. Nevertheless, the internationalist and Roosevelt came more and more to the front. For example, he chose not to define the conflict between Japan and China as a war, and thus he was able to back the naval rearmament of China and authorize the sale of some $86 million in munitions. Roosevelt did this in order to get around the Neutrality Act of 1935, right? So this is kind of how he was pragmatic. He did what needed to be done, while at the same time making a belated attempt to preserve the open-door policy in Asia. For the next 4 years, the United States and the Axis powers moved on a collision course. Isolationists and internationalists were locked in a great debate over foreign affairs. September 1st, 1939, Hitler began World War II by invading Poland. As a result, England and France responded 2 days later by declaring war on Germany. Russia had played a key role, refusing Western overtures for a common front against Germany, and finally signing a non-aggression treaty with Hitler in late August of that year. So the so-called Nazi-Soviet pact enabled Germany to avoid a two-front war, or at least put off the inevitability of a two-front war. The Russians were rewarded with a generous slice of eastern Poland. Basically, they split Poland in two. In response to these events, Roosevelt embarked on what Time magazine called at the time a 1,000-step road to war. Once hostilities broke out, Roosevelt made no secret of his sympathies. This nation will remain a neutral nation, he stated, but I cannot ask every American to remain neutral in thought as well. 2 weeks after the outbreak of war in Europe, Roosevelt called Congress into special session to revise the neutrality legislation. He wanted to repeal the arms embargo in order to supply weapons to England and France, but he refused to state this aim openly. Instead, he asked Congress to replace the arms embargo with cash and carry regulations. Belligerents would be able to purchase war supplies in the United States, but they would have to pay cash and transport the goods in their own ships. Public opinion strongly supported the president, and Congress passed the revised neutrality policy by heavy margins in early November 1939. In November, the Nazi armies conquered Norway, Denmark, the Netherlands, Belgium, and France. Meanwhile, German planes bombed Britain in preparations for invasion. Technically, the United States remained neutral through these events, but Roosevelt and an ever-growing a number of Americans were clearly rooting for Britain and France and against the Axis powers. In the climax of the great debate over foreign policy, the crucial turning point from isolation to collective security was the Lend-Lease Act of 1941. This law was promoted by Prime Minister Winston Churchill, alarming report that Britain was running out of both cash and credit, since direct American loans would arouse memories of early war debt defaults. The Johnson Act of 1934 forbade such loans. Anyway, Roosevelt created an ingenious device to bypass the issue and yet supply British needs, the Lend-Lease program. So in a fireside chat on December 1940, he told the nation it must become, quote, the great arsenal of democracy because of the threat of British fall. So let's take a listen to this very important fireside chat by FDR.
My friends, this is not a fireside chat on war. It is a talk on national security, because the nub of the whole purpose of your president is to keep you now and your children later and your grandchildren much later out of a last-ditch war for the preservation of American independence and all of the things that American independence means to you and to me and to ours. Tonight, in the presence of a world crisis, my mind goes back 8 years to a night in the midst of a domestic crisis. It was a time when the wheels of American industry were grinding to a full stop, when the whole banking system of our country had ceased to function. I well remember that while I sat in my study in the White House, preparing to talk with the people of the United States, I had before my eyes the picture of all those Americans with whom I was talking. I saw the workmen in the mills, the mines, the factories, the girl behind the counter, the small shopkeeper, the farmer doing his spring plowing, the widows and the old men wondering about their life's savings. I tried to convey to the great mass of American people what the banking crisis meant to them in their daily lives. Tonight I want to do the same thing with the same people in this new crisis which faces America. We met the issue of 1933 with courage and realism. We face this new crisis, this new threat to the security of our nation, with the same courage and realism. Never before since Jamestown and Plymouth Rock has our American civilization been in such danger as now. For on September 27, 1940, this year, by an agreement signed in Berlin, 3 powerful nations, 2 in Europe and 1 in Asia, joined themselves together in the threat that if the United States of America interfered with or blocked the expansion program of these 3 nations, a program aimed at world control, they would unite in ultimate action against the United States. The Nazi masters of Germany have made it clear that they intend not only to dominate all life and thought in their own country, but also to enslave the whole of Europe, and then to use the resources of Europe to dominate the rest of the world. We must be the great arsenal of democracy. For us, this is an emergency as serious as war itself. We must apply ourselves to our task with the same resolution, the same sense of urgency, the same spirit of patriotism and sacrifice as we would show were we at war. We have furnished the British great material support, and we will furnish far more in the future. there will be no bottlenecks in our determination to aid Great Britain. No dictator, no combination of dictators will weaken that determination by threats of how they will construe that determination. The British have received invaluable military support from the heroic Greek army and from the forces of all the governments in exile. Their strength is growing. It is the strength of men and women who value their freedom more highly than they value their lives. I believe that the Axis powers are not going to win this war. I base that belief on the latest and best of information. We have no excuse for defeatism. We have every good reason for hope. Hope for peace, yes, and hope for the defense of our civilization and for the building of a better civilization in the future. I have the profound conviction that the American people are now determined to put forth a mightier effort than they have ever yet made to increase our production of all the implements of defense to meet the threat to our democratic faith. As President of the United States, I call for that national effort. I call for it in the name of this nation which we love and honor, and which we are privileged and proud to serve. I call upon our people with absolute confidence that our common cause will greatly succeed.
All right, I wanted to just play that in its entirety, just to give you a sense of urgency during this time, and the precarious political battles Roosevelt was having to play at this point. Because still, even though many Americans and policymakers alike were concerned about what was going on in Europe and the Pacific alike, most Americans were overwhelmingly in support of staying out of the conflicts. So continuing on Roosevelt's slow drift towards getting the United States involved in the war, in January 1941, in a speech to Congress, FDR warned that the British Navy stood between American and the peril of attack. They do not need manpower. They need billions of dollars worth of weapons of defense, unquote. In March of 1941, the Lend-Lease Bill became law, and it authorized the president to sell, transfer, exchange, lend, lease, or otherwise dispose of arms and other equipment and supplies to, quote, any country whose defense the president deems vital to the defense of the United States. The accompanying $7 billion appropriation ended the cash part of the cash and carry and ensured Britain full access to American war supplies. To cut for abolitionists angrily denounced the Lend-Lease as both unnecessary and untruthful. Lending war equipment is a good deal like lending chewing gum, commented Senator Taft. You don't want it back. So thus, in March 1941, the country was traveling a far more dangerous path than it had a few years earlier. Neutrality acts had now given way to the Lend-Lease policy. In leading the nation to the brink of war in Europe, Roosevelt opened himself to criticism from both sides in the domestic debate. Interventionists felt he had been too cautious in dealing with the danger to the nation from Nazi Germany. isolationists were equally critical of the president, claiming he had misled the American people for professing peace while plotting for war. Roosevelt agreed with the interventionists that in the long run, America's security would be threatened by a German victory in Europe. However, he also was aware of a poll taken in September 1941 that showed nearly 80% of the American people wanted to stay out of World War II. So this was something the president could not ignore. Realizing that that leading a divided nation into war would be disastrous, and wisely so, Roosevelt played for time, inching the country toward war while waiting for the Axis nation to make the ultimate move. Japan would be the one in Pearl Harbor. So on the morning of December 7th, 1941, war came to the United States unexpectedly. On that day, Japanese planes streaked over the sky to bomb the American naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. This carefully planned attack killed more than 2,000 American servicemen and sank or disabled 19 ships. It dealt a terrible blow both to the nation's naval power and to its pride. Congress declared war on Japan one day later, and Germany and Italy then declared war on the United States.